Thank you again, Madam Speaker. Yesterday, the 5th of December, 2023, marked 10 years since the passing of Nelson Mandela, the late President of South Africa, and I thought that I should mark the passing with an expression of remembrance on behalf of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. The history of the Bahamas and Nelson Mandela are intertwined. It was here that in 1985, at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, chaired by our founding Prime Minister, Sir Lyndon Pinling, that the Nassau Accords were agreed to impose sanctions on the racist regime in South Africa as a result of their insistence on the continuation of apartheid. It was here, on the steps of this House of Assembly in 1979, that myself, the late Beryl Hannah, late Vern Darville, Sandra Dean Patterson, Glenys Hannah Martin, stood to denounce the system of apartheid and to begin what was called the Bahamas Committee on Southern Africa and the campaign for the freedom of Nelson Mandela. You will recall that he had been imprisoned by the regime in South Africa for offenses against public order and had been branded a terrorist and treasonous because of his opposition to apartheid. It is important to note that one day you're branded a terrorist, the next day you're called a hero. On the 23rd of December, 1993, Nelson Mandela landed in the Bahamas and spent a week here, leaving our country on the 30th of December, 1993. While here, he met our public officials, including our then Prime Minister Hubert Ingram, and the Cabinet, including the Foreign Minister, Sir Orville Turnquest. He was hosted at the home of Sir Lyndon and then Lady Pinling. Upon his arrival, I renewed my brief acquaintance with him at the then Nassau International Airport, and I've included in this statement the photo of the press conference which he held upon his arrival, the photo taken by Peter Ramsey of the Bahamas Information Services. I had met him earlier in the late summer of 1992, when I spent 6 weeks in South Africa. I was then a senator as an observer for the Commonwealth, as we sought to shepherd the transition to the democratic process in South Africa. That transition took place in 1994, and South Africa is still alive and free today. That transition took place, as I said, in 1994, and in the 6 weeks I spent there, I traveled the length and breadth of the country and met with all levels of public officials and leaders of the independence movement in South Africa and the apartheid government. In September of 1992, I met Mr. Mandela, whom we call affectionately Madiba, at his headquarters of the ANC in Johannesburg. It was an honor, and one which I will never forget, and which I had never expected, and I'm probably the first Bahamian to have met him. Indeed, his freedom from prison is a lesson to those who think that life is hopeless, that often the darkest hour is just before dawn. I was in Duncantown, Ragged Island, where Nelson Mandela was freed by the apartheid regime. It had gotten to the point of them begging him to leave prison. Such was their desperation to save their regime. He came out on his own terms, hand in hand with his wife, Winnie. That was the 10th of February, 1990, some 33 years and change ago. I remember the day because it was the day of the rededication of the Anglican Church in Duncantown, and it was amongst the last of the public appearances of the late Sir Cecil Wallace Whitfield, then leader of the opposition. We flew to Nassau on the same plane, home. Archdeacon Keith Cartwright had rebuilt the little chapel in Duncantown. As Honorary Secretary of the Committee on Southern Africa, it was my job to issue the statement welcoming his freedom from prison and the march toward a new South Africa. There were no cell phones or tablets then, and I had to hoof it down to the local Batelco station, send a telegram to my friend, the late Clunas Devaney, who was then the editor of the Nassau Guardian, to issue the statement, which was carried the next day on the front pages of the Bahamian press. I joined Prime Minister Perry Christie at the funeral of Mr. Mandela, held in Johannesburg on the 10th of December 1993. Thanks to the then Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala Persad-Bissessar, we flew with all CARICOM heads of government to South Africa from Port of Spain by Caribbean Airlines 767 jet, a 13-hour journey from Port of Spain to Johannesburg. Now, I was prompted for these remembrances by an article which I saw recently about the complexity of the legacy of Nelson Mandela. South Africa is a profoundly different place today than it was 10 years ago, 30 years ago. Its government is democratically elected, but it's having a rough time with its people, especially the young people, thinking that the troubles they face may be a direct result of the freedom they obtained under Mr. Mandela. This often happens as the great moment fades from the minds of those who were present, and many of the pioneers in the fight have died. The next generation simply does not appreciate the struggles in the face of the present tides. We see it happening in our own Bahamas. The article said that Nelson Mandela has a public legacy of having brought peace and reconciliation to his country by the extraordinary acts of forgiveness that he displayed to those who had despitefully used him. But the public persona was an act of discipline in the national interest. He was deeply saddened and often angry and depressed at the years that he spent in prison and how he was treated. But that was the private man. The public man kept his composure and brought about an era of peace to the nation and stepped down after one term. During the time he was in prison, he lost 2 of his children and his mother. He was not allowed to attend their funeral. His marriage broke up as a result of a lifetime of being away from his wife. I had the honor of going to the house that Winnie Mandela built for him while he was in prison, but which he never lived in, located in the Soweto township. As she took me around the house, even as divorce proceedings were looming, she insisted that the house would be kept ready and waiting for the great man to return home. Sadly, there was no reconciliation, so he lost his family life. Fortunately, he found solace in his 3rd wife, Gracia Marcel, the widow of Samora Machel, the former president of Mozambique, and they lived a great life together until his end. Now, I saw Mr. Mandela really angry. This was the private man. One day, Chief Emeka Anyoko, then Secretary General of the Commonwealth, came calling in Johannesburg to try and persuade Mr. Mandela to meet and settle differences with Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was then leader of the Zulus. Buthelezi died just this year at the age of 95. They were arch enemies. Mr. Mandela refused, and he shouted and banged on the table, "Why should I meet him? Who is he? And why should I meet him?" In the end, Gacha, as Chief Buthelezi was called, served as Mr. Mandela's Home Affairs Minister. And I was there when Nelson Mandela danced with the late Gus Cooper at Junkanoo, the Boxing Day parade in December of 1993. It was one of those moments when you could sing the Nunc Dimittis. Madam Speaker, that is a short history of Nelson Mandela and the Bahamas. Nelson Mandela and this Member of Parliament. 10 years later, he's still a great man and an icon. A Mandela. May he rest in peace. I put the wrong date here twice.